Senator Marco Rubio, welcome to Capital Games. And I want to talk first from the perspective of the Cuban people about the legacy of sports. How important has baseball been to the Cuban identity in the Castro era? We know that the national teams, and there's so many famous athletes that have come up through the major leagues as defectors, but what does it mean to the Cuban people? What has sports meant?
Well, obviously, I've never lived on the island of Cuba. I certainly have seen the experience from those who have come, and obviously know about pre-Castro Cuba because of my parents. But look, baseball is the one thing that's been constant. There've been obviously changes on the island in terms of human rights, and it went from a bad dictator to a worse dictator from Batista to Castro. But baseball is truly kind of ingrained into the spirit of the island and of the people of Cuba. It is not just the number one sport; it's by far above and beyond any other sport that the island knows. And just as an example, my grandfather, who was disabled as a young child with polio, even though he wasn't able to run and so forth, even he tried at least to play some baseball because it was just part of what you did when you were a young man growing up in Cuba. So it's deeply embedded in the Cuban identity, and it's the by far the one sport that unifies the island.
Senator, you've been harshly critical of President Obama's efforts to normalize relations with Cuba, and he made that trip, sat next to Raul Castro back in March. But what role can sports play in this now post-Fidel Cuba? Would you like to see more diplomacy along those lines, or is that sending exactly the wrong message?
Well, a couple things I would say. Number one is I haven't been critical of what he did. I'm critical of how he did it. Do I believe that we should explore changes to the Cuba-U.S. relationship? I do. But the question is, how do you do it? And are you doing it in a way that furthers, number one, our national interest, and number two, related to our national interest, respect for human rights and democracy and the sorts of things that we're engaged all over the world in promoting and have been involved in sanctioning other countries for denying. And so my whole view of it is, if you're going to make changes to Cuba policy, shouldn't it be policies that somehow further those goals? As far as sports is concerned, look, I'm a big sports fan. I always try to separate sports from politics, and that's the way we view sports in this country. It is not the way the Castro regime has traditionally viewed sports. They have viewed sports as part of their overall myth-making and strategic political advantage, and so they have always, and that's why, for example, they don't allow athletes to leave the island. They have to escape in order to get out. That's why they so harsh with defectors and their families. As you know, the story of Livan Hernandez and then El Duque Orlando, who left a few years later, how he was treated on the island after his brother left. And so for us, I think sports is about sports. For them, whether it's sports or art or anything else, it's deeply politicized on the island of Cuba, and I think it makes it difficult. But I'd like to see I'd like to see all Cubans be able to travel freely, but I'd like to see Cuban baseball players be able to travel freely and play in this country if they so desire.
And to the lower level, I know people in my community here in Connecticut that at the sort of middle school level have had exchanges where they've gone down to Cuba as a baseball team, and Cuban baseball players and staff have come up here. And it seems like at that grassroots level, it's a great way to build relationships, to understand each other's culture. What are the chances, do you think, that something like that can continue and foster, especially under a new administration?
Well, that's existed before Obama's changes. I mean, there's been cultural exchanges with Cuba going back 20 years. And so there's nothing new about that. I think that, the only warning I always give visitors is understand that when you go to Cuba, your trips are tightly managed and you're allowed to see what you want to see. My only problem is people that come back and tell me how great it is. I understand the beauty of the island and the hospitality of the people, but don't tell me their system of government is perfect or good or even comparable to ours because of their economy or their politics or anything like ours. You wouldn't have thousands of people risking their lives to get out of the country. So but as far as those exchanges, they've existed for a long, long time, and I imagine will continue to.
Yeah, I'm curious your reaction to what happened during the Dolphins-49ers game. That's where really politics spilled onto the sports world. Colin Kaepernick was challenged by Armando Salguero, the columnist from Miami Herald, for a little while ago, wearing not just it wasn't the Malcolm X T-shirt, it was the fact that Castro was on that T-shirt. Kaepernick is now saying his sort of statements were a little misconstrued, but it was more on the field where the Dolphins' Kiko Alonso tackles Kaepernick and sort of halts the 49ers' attempt to, tie the game and potentially win it, and they win. And then after the game, he makes it clear on Twitter that this was essentially for his Cuban roots. What did you think of what played out there?
Well, I think he would have made that hit even if it had been Tom Brady, you know. So, because I mean, it kind of win the game. And Kiko had a great game, and it was obviously tied into the whole. I mean, just the setting of it was unique. Look, I think I don't know Colin Kaepernick. I think he's a young man that has strong views, which I think he has every right to express. On the issue of Cuba, I think, unfortunately, he is symptomatic of a broader issue, and that is just a fundamental misunderstanding of Fidel Castro as some sort of heroic figure. That, the attitude some people have is, he did some things bad, but by and large, he also did a lot of good things. I would challenge that. I would say he's no different than any of these other, caudillos and strong men that have bedeviled Latin America for the better part of 150 years, except that 20% of the people that lived on the island of Cuba had to go into exile. There's horrifying stories of torture, imprisonment, mass executions. That's the legacy of Fidel Castro. And and even some of the accomplishments that Colin cited in his press conference are not accurate. I mean, Cuba does not have the highest literacy rate in the world. They do not have a world-class medical system, at least for their people. They have some private hospitals that are better than some of the other countries in the region, still not comparable to ours, but as far as what's available to the Cuban people from a medical perspective, it's not comparable. So a lot of it is just people that buy into the myth that of Fidel Castro, which has been endemic on the left. I mean, I saw national reporters the other day on the verge, a couple on the verge, it looked like they were about to cry announcing the death of Fidel Castro and the way that they lionized him. So unfortunately, I think Colin Kaepernick has bought into some of that, and I encourage him to learn a little bit more about the full story of Fidel Castro. But I'm not sure it had any impact on the outcome of that game. He actually played a pretty good game.
I know that. I know. Hey, Rick, one quick follow-up. I just want to, with the senator, educationally, it seems to me, and I've got kids, and one in high school, one in middle school, and I still get the sense, in talking about Fidel Castro's death with them over the last couple of days, that in our public schools, I just don't get the sense we're doing a great job of educating the full scope of Cuba and the United States and Castro and the relationships. We hear about Bay of Pigs, and that's essentially it. Where's the failing in terms of the full scope of the history of Cuba under Castro? Yeah,
I mean, I think we're failing to teach our own history here in this country, so you can just imagine how much time we spend on a small island in the Caribbean, 12, 13 million people. But, look, I think one thing Castro was very good at was myth-making. I mean, he created this myth that he was some sort of major league prospect as a pitcher. It's false. It's just not true. He created this myth that he's got this, heroic society where the racial equality. It's not true. I mean, I encourage people, go on Google, pull up the images of the meetings of the Council of Ministers, all the high-level officials in Cuba. You'll find very few people of color in an island where about 50% or more of the population is either mixed or of African descent. And there's no representation at the upper echelons of leadership. So these are all myths, and he's done a good job of creating myth, and it's perpetuated by some in the media who I think identify with the political left. And our education system doesn't spend a lot of time teaching Cuba, probably as much time as it does teaching Dominican Republic history or Haitian history or the history of any other country in the region. So, for those of us who know a little bit more about this issue or care about it, when the opportunity presents itself, it's important for us to talk about it. But really, for me, the focus is on the future. I mean, Fidel Castro has largely been irrelevant for the better part of a decade now, other than I think he acted as kind of dictator emeritus who kind of sat back and from time to time opined or weighed in on issues from a macro perspective. But the governance of the country has largely been in the hands of his brother Raul now for about 10 years.
Well, I want to talk about the future lastly before we let you go, Senator, because Fidel's death happens at this interesting time in American politics where you have President-elect Trump, who immediately tweeted that he would roll back policies. I think he said he wanted a better deal, although it's not clear exactly what he's talking about with the deal. How confident are you that you see eye to eye on Cuba policy with Trump? We know he's had business interests and made trips there in the past to explore things. He's talked about wanting to potentially open businesses down there. How read in is he, and how confident are you that you're going to see what you would like out of this new Republican administration?
Well, first of all, let me just say this. I understand people that are not versed on it, that don't grow up in South Florida, and this is not a central issue they think about every day, having views on Cuba, and we're always looking to convert people and change their minds on it. And so, Donald may have had a view 15, 12 years ago, and it may have changed, and that's good. We welcome that. The second thing I would say is I think the logical thing to do, and where I think we're at like mind, is let's look at the current status of U.S.-Cuba relations, and let's figure out from the perspective of our goals, which are, number one, our national security interests and the interests of America, and number two, freedom and democracy, and I actually believe they're intertwined. what policies should remain in place, which ones should be altered, which ones should be reversed. And let's be smart about it now and figure out what helps us move forward, because to me it's not just about the next year, it's about the next 10 years. I can tell you that Raul Castro's 85, and I don't expect that a decade from now he'll be governing the country, and if you believe him, 2 years from now he won't be governing the country. So what can we do in our policies to help create the environment and or the pathway towards a more free and more democratic Cuba, or at least the opportunity for the Cuban people to achieve that for themselves in the foreseeable future, is what I hope to be able to do. And it's going to take some time to review all that, but that's what I hope we'll do.
And you're confident that you can work together on that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, certainly every interaction I've had on the issue has been positive. We'll see. Obviously, there'll be other voices in the room and other people with their own opinions. We'll see how all that plays out. But I'm confident that their goals mirror ours, which is we want to review these policies and make sure that we change the ones that don't make sense, and that everything that we're doing is in our national security interest, but also something that helps the Cuban people be able to achieve democracy for themselves.
Senator Marco Rubio, Republican, Florida, thanks for being here with us on Capital Games. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.